So we're going to get started and talk about SharePoint from the beginning. As you can see on the flow chart, as I mentioned in the first video in this new YouTube channel, Modern SharePoint Tutorials. So in part one, I'm going to just be talking about some of the history of SharePoint, what is SharePoint, what can it be used for, how to get it, and some of the other things you see in part one here. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. If you're wondering where you can try out SharePoint if you've never used it before, here is a web page. I'll include links to these resources in the description of the video. So here you can see there's 4 different options: Microsoft 365 Business Basic, Microsoft 365 Business Standard, Microsoft 365 Business Premium, and Microsoft 365 Apps for Business. And as it says here, it only includes apps. So if we scroll down and look for SharePoint, here on the one on the right side, we do not see SharePoint listed. But if we look in the other ones, all the other 3, it's listed. And so if you want to try it out also, there's a link here on this page. You can try it for 1 month for free. And there are terms you have to check out before you do that. It would be a good idea to give it a quick read. So there's how you can acquire a trial for SharePoint if you want to see what it looks like and how it works. SharePoint really is an awesome tool. It's been around for a long time, and it's actually used behind Microsoft Teams if you've ever used that. And it's very powerful and has hundreds if not thousands of different features. So let's take a look here on Google and see what it can tell us about SharePoint. I'll just highlight some things here as it's explaining SharePoint. It's a web-based collaborative platform that integrates natively with Microsoft 365. It was launched in 2001. It's primarily sold as a document management and storage system, but it is a lot more than that. Organizations use SharePoint to create websites. You can use it as a secure place to store, organize, share, and access information from any device. All you need is a web browser like Edge or Chrome or Firefox. Normally I use Chrome for accessing SharePoint. And we can look at some other things here. Is SharePoint part of Office 365? Microsoft 365 is considered, or the consolidation of several applications including SharePoint. While SharePoint is an individual platform that allows you to manage and share your files with members of your company and create an internal intranet. Is it hard to learn SharePoint? Well, SharePoint is massive, but many parts of it are fairly easy and other parts are pretty complex, and it does integrate with many different pieces of the Microsoft universe of software. So as they say here, is it hard or easy to learn? As with so many other software and cloud platforms, SharePoint becomes more complicated the deeper you delve into its features and nuances. Learning the basics of its document management and storage is relatively straightforward for anyone familiar with how similar systems work. How is it different than Teams? Well, Microsoft Teams is the hub for teamwork. It allows for collaboration, chat, calls, meetings, and so much more. SharePoint Online is primarily a document management and intranet platform where you store, collaborate, and share information seamlessly across the organization, and is also part of Microsoft 365. Is SharePoint free? Well, we already looked at the costs for getting SharePoint. There used to be free versions of SharePoint in the past, but they've done away with that. And there's also several different versions of SharePoint, which we'll get to that. Can anyone access my SharePoint site? You can give people permission to the site by adding individual users, security groups, or Microsoft 365 groups to one of the 3 SharePoint groups. Can everyone access SharePoint? If you're the Microsoft SharePoint site owner, you can give access to other people to the site by adding them as owners, members, or visitors. As I briefly mentioned, here's a question: can Teams replace SharePoint? All files shared in Microsoft Teams are actually stored in SharePoint Online, so you keep all of the advantages that SharePoint offers. So SharePoint and Teams are directly integrated. So next I pulled up the Wikipedia. There is a lot of information here, and it does showcase the fact that there is a lot going on with SharePoint. So I'm just going to go ahead and scroll through this a little bit and point out some interesting things that I see. As they explain here, SharePoint is a web-based collaborative platform that integrates natively with Microsoft 365, previously Microsoft Office. It was launched in 2001, and it's primarily sold as a document management and storage system. However, the product is highly configurable and its usage varies substantially among organizations, which is true. You can use a little bit of it, more of it, all of it. There's just so many different parts to SharePoint. It's really amazing. You can set up intranets, web pages, websites, content management systems, document libraries, business processes, workflows, and integrate with other tools also. So there are various editions of SharePoint which have different functions. SharePoint Foundation was discontinued in 2016. SharePoint Standard, there are versions that you can install like on your own servers if you wanted to do that and maintain them yourself. That's what SharePoint Standard and SharePoint Server are. And SharePoint Enterprise, you need an additional license. But if we scroll down a little further here, we'll see SharePoint Online. SharePoint Online is what I've used the most of in the recent time, and that is Microsoft's hosted SharePoint in their cloud, and it's bundled in the Microsoft 365 subscriptions like we looked at on the pricing page. There's several advantages to it. You don't have to maintain all of that hardware and networking and firewalls and security and updates. So it really, I think, is very affordable considering how much time and money you can save to let them, the experts with it, go ahead and keep it up to date and maintained. You do get like what's called a tenant, so like one main site as a default. So you typically would make everything work inside of there. But there are other options to consider. And it is updated, I would say, frequently. They're mentioning different changes that show up in the UI as Microsoft gets ready to push out new capabilities and features of it. So here are some additional capabilities. Support for the SPFX SharePoint Framework extensions for software developers. It has the new modern responsive SharePoint UX. Partially included in 2016, Feature Pack 1, Yammer integration and Office 365 groups, integration with Outlook web app, newer versions of Office or online Office document editor tools, removal of various file size and number limitations, and apps concept. So now they go on to talk about applications of it, enterprise content management and document management. Since it allows for storage and retrieval, has really great searching capabilities, archiving capabilities, tracking capabilities, like revision history, content management system, management and reporting on electronic documents and records. You can also look at using some of the newer features like sensitivity labels and integrating some of those things with SharePoint. Many of the functions in this product are designed around various legal, information management, and process requirements in organizations. They allow for collaborative real-time editing between multiple users and encrypted information rights management synchronization. A lot of times, companies may replace a file server with SharePoint because it has a better user interface to it and a lot more features. Internet and social networks. A SharePoint Internet or Internet portal is a way to centralize access to enterprise information and applications. I think that's a really good point. You can have information scattered all over the place as time goes on in the history of an organization, and if it's done correctly and well thought out, you can make your SharePoint portal the central point for all this information. It helps organizations manage their internal communications for teams and projects and documents, applications, and information more easily. Microsoft claims that this has organizational benefits such as increased employee engagement, centralized process management, reducing new staff onboarding costs, and providing means to capture and share knowledge via tools like wikis, media libraries, team sites, and more. SharePoint contains team collaboration groupware capabilities like project scheduling, which is integrated with Outlook and Project, social collaboration, shared mailboxes, project-related document storage, and collaboration. It's based around the concept of a team site, and we'll look at that in future videos. When you're creating new sites, you have two main ways: a communication hub or a communication site and a team site. It's just a way to organize your information, and it has a different look and feel to it. Custom web applications. SharePoint's custom development capabilities provide an additional layer of services that allow rapid prototyping and integrated web applications. SharePoint provides developers with integration into corporate directories and data sources through standards such as REST, OData, and OAuth. So there is a REST API that you can do many things inside of SharePoint from whatever application that you might be working on or developing. And you can test it with tools like Postman and other HTTP testing tools when you're building your web applications. SharePoint also has an enterprise app store that has different types of external applications which are encapsulated and managed to access to resources such as corporate user data and document data. So then we get into content structure. What does that look like? Well, you have SharePoint pages, which are like freeform pages which can be edited in the web browser. They are used to provide content to users or to provide structure to the SharePoint environment. Web parts and app parts. Web parts are a very vital part of how SharePoint works, and there's a lot of them. And so you can insert these web parts, which are like Lego blocks, building blocks, and arrange them in whatever order you want using drag and drop with your mouse. They're used to display information from SharePoint and third-party applications. So web parts are a very important part of building pages and building out a SharePoint site. Then you get into content items, content types, which are very important. Like, you could also think of it as metadata, data that describes the content itself, which then makes it easier to search and find it when people are looking for information in the SharePoint site. Then you have libraries. like libraries of documents. List is like a Excel sheet of information or a database set of records. And so you have SharePoint libraries and SharePoint lists. Those are the two main things that you will encounter besides web pages or SharePoint pages and web parts. Everything is grouped together in a site. So here we can see a SharePoint site. It's a collection of pages, lists, libraries, apps, configuration, features, content types, and subsites. Although I don't use subsites anymore, I use hub sites and associated hub sites. Examples of site templates in SharePoint include collaboration, which are team sites, and communication sites, which is what I mentioned briefly before. Organization sites, wiki sites, blank sites, and publishing sites. So SharePoint has a web-based configuration. It's all done through a web browser typically, although you can interface with it like through PowerShell scripts or custom C# code. The SharePoint Designer is a semi-deprecated product that provided advanced editing capabilities for HTML and ASPX pages. And some are still using it for SharePoint workflows. Although now we have the Power Automate integrated into SharePoint, which is used a lot for building out automation processes alongside SharePoint. Custom development, we have the SharePoint framework SPFX, which provides a development model based on the TypeScript language. The technical stack is Node.js, Yeoman, Gulp, NPM, and Webpack. So more modern tools, and like if you're using React, that's a good front end library or framework to use along with these other tools. There's also the SharePoint client object model available for JavaScript and .NET, and the REST and SOAP APIs can be referenced from many environments. So then it gets into server architecture, which I won't be talking about that because that is SharePoint Server, and pretty much everything I'll be talking about in my 6-part series will have to do with SharePoint Online and not the self-hosted versions of SharePoint. SharePoint's architecture enables a least privilege execution permission model. As I mentioned, SharePoint integrates with Microsoft 365. It provides various APIs. It can be used to achieve compliance with many document retention, records management, document ID, and discovery laws. And so here's a table of other SharePoint related Microsoft products. You can see there's a lot listed there. So now let's take a look at the history of SharePoint. It evolved from projects codenamed Office Server and Tahoe during the Office XP development cycle. Office Server evolved out of the front page and Office Server extensions and team pages. It targeted simple bottom-up collaboration. Tahoe built on shared technology with Exchange and the digital dashboard. Targeted top-down portals, search, and document management. The searching and indexing capabilities of SharePoint came from the Tahoe feature set. The search and indexing features were a combination of the index and crawling features from the Microsoft Site Server MSS family of products from the query language of the Microsoft Index Server. So here's a history of the versions going back to around 2001. The Office Server extensions, SharePoint Portal Server 2001, SharePoint Team Services, Windows SharePoint Services 2.0, which had a free license, SharePoint Portal Server 2003, Windows SharePoint Services 3.0 with a free license, and then MOS, Microsoft Office SharePoint Server 2007. And then it gets into SharePoint Foundation 2010, which was free, and the SharePoint 2010 server, Microsoft SharePoint Foundation 2013, which had a free license. And then we get into SharePoint Online Plan 1 and 2, which was around 2016. And then you have the SharePoint Server 2016 and 2019, which are on-premise versions of SharePoint. There were many notable changes made over time. Notable changes in SharePoint 2010, the new Fluent ribbon, using wiki pages rather than web part pages, social profiles, restructure of shared service providers, sandbox solutions, and a client-side object model APIs for JavaScript, Silverlight, and .NET applications. Notable changes in SharePoint 2013, cross-browser drag and drop support for file uploads and follow and share buttons, OneDrive for Business, updates to the social network feature and new task aggregation tool, the audit center called eDiscovery, rebuilt and improved search capabilities. Notable changes in SharePoint 2016, hybrid improvements, single sites view, unified search, search sensitive information in hybrid search, performance scaling and deployment improvements, search scaling capabilities, site collection enhancement, deterministic view threshold, removing the 5,000 limit, deployment improvements including zero downtime patching. And then notable changes in SharePoint 2019, modern sites and page layouts, that's very important, communication sites, which we'll be looking at those, large file support, character restrictions, and file and folder names. So I know that was a lot of different things, but again, I just wanted to point out some of the history of where SharePoint has come from, and we'll be looking at all those features in the upcoming videos. I pulled up a page here from Microsoft itself, SharePoint products and downloads. SharePoint can refer to one or more SharePoint products or technologies, including SharePoint and Microsoft 365. That's mostly what we are talking about, which is a cloud-based service hosted by Microsoft for businesses of all sizes. Instead of installing and deploying SharePoint Server on premises, any business can subscribe to a Microsoft 365 plan or to the standalone SharePoint Online service. Your employees can create sites to share documents and information with colleagues, partners, and customers. And I already showed the links to get started with that. Then, of course, you have the on-site, on-premise SharePoint server. The SharePoint Designer 2013 was a free program, last released in 2013. Used to build powerful workflow-enabled solutions and used to edit external content types. OneDrive Sync, a desktop program that you can use to sync documents from a team site or OneDrive for work or school or to your computer for offline use. So I will include a link to this website from Microsoft about SharePoint. So now let's take another look at SharePoint from a different standpoint. I asked Google, is SharePoint popular? According to what they're saying here, SharePoint is one of the most popular and widely used enterprise applications in the world. It has an impressive 200 million active monthly users. 80% of Fortune 500 companies use it, and its market share in the content collaboration segment is 75%. That's from April 17 2023. So I think that sounds accurate to me, and I know SharePoint is very popular and very widely used. And again, as we just looked at in the history of it, there is a ton of features. It's why I have a 6-part series, because there is so much involved in SharePoint. So many different things you can do with it. Why is SharePoint so popular? It's highly scalable, can be used in organizations with a few employees, up to 20,000 employees and beyond. Unlike many alternative internet products, you can enhance SharePoint with the required functionality needed for the business. It's supported and common practice. And I think it's a valid question, does SharePoint have a future? In 2023, SharePoint is doing more than ever. More integration, like with Teams, with Microsoft Teams. It's the back end for that. Becoming friendlier, which is true, and growing as a platform to accommodate all kinds of content and services. So someone mentioned here cons, disadvantages of SharePoint. Well, it can be complex. I mean, a 6-part video series with dozens and dozens of videos just to cover the basics of it, I think shows and proves that it is quite complicated, and there's so many things you can do with it. So sure, it can be complex. It's an investment to make, but I do think it pays off if used properly. Another con is its expensive implementation and customization. Its extensive range of features can create a mess, and integrations require extra development effort, like programmers developing custom add-ins and things like that. Is SharePoint in demand? SharePoint development services are in high demand. This technology is the only one that allows for easy online document sharing. Well, I don't know about that, but it does have a lot of features, and it is pretty easy to use for the more basic things. Many businesses, regardless of industry, are looking for enterprise content management and enterprise applications. And with all the things that come along with SharePoint, you can save a tremendous amount of time and money and effort by just using and learning what's in SharePoint to begin with. So let's take a quick look at salary estimates for information architects. I feel like people who are using SharePoint and setting it up and customizing it, who also do some development, like software development, would be considered a information architect. And we can see here salary estimates range from $73,000 to $130,000 per year. Glassdoor says $83,000 to $200,000 per year. ZipRecruiter, $94,000 to $170,000 per year. And we can look here, is information architect a good career? Yes, hiring managers are increasingly looking for information architects, and salaries are lucrative. That's from May 15th, 2023. So what does an information architect do? An information architecture or information architect focuses on organizing, structuring, and labeling content in an effective and sustainable way. The goal is to help users find information and complete tasks. Well, if you know about SharePoint and look at all of its features, that is what SharePoint is mainly about: organizing your content, structuring it, labeling it with metadata and or other features like sensitivity labels and other parts of the Microsoft universe of software. And you can think about laying out content, laying out web pages, websites, laying out your information. And there's also ways to customize the SharePoint user interface, which I will talk about in one of the other videos, such as views. You can customize views using JSON, and hide and remove buttons and hide and remove other features, add your own buttons and links and so forth into the various places inside of the SharePoint user interface. So I feel like those would also be part of what an information architect would do in the context of using SharePoint. So I know this was a pretty long video, maybe boring to some. However, I think it's important to establish a baseline about where SharePoint came from, what the history of it was, what does it cost, how do you get it. So we've looked at several different parts of this part 1 in this first video. And so in the next video, I will continue on showing how to log into SharePoint, looking at users and some of the admin tools. And we'll just keep going through these videos to help you if you've never used it or want a refresher on the way that the current version of SharePoint Online looks and how it works these days. So lastly, I updated my flowchart to show what was discussed. And so we'll be ending this video here, and I appreciate you taking the time to watch the video, and hopefully you learned some things about SharePoint. And I'll talk to you soon.
If you like this channel, please like and subscribe and hit the bell icon to be notified when I post new content.